have a very special episode where we are welcoming a special guest. We have Professor Wendelin Kupers here with us today, and we are going to talk about integral and leadership. And from what I hear, Wendelin Kupers, you are an expert in both leadership and integral, and we're going to get into some specifics on how you've seen it used in Agile and talk a bit about our experience and ask questions. And it's just going to be a fun conversation today. So I'm going to hand it over to you and introduce yourself and tell us more about what it is that you do and that you talk about.
Yes, many thanks, Alana, for this introduction and also for having me, actually. And I'll start with a brief introduction. My journey into the integral is also quite for some time, and I'm trying to relate integral to leadership and to organization studies and practice. So I'm trying to link the two, organization and leadership and integral, and try to bring it together. And I'm in the role of being a professor at a university, at a private university in Germany, and also serving as a dean and academic vice president of this university. And this is kind of important because leadership in practice and leadership in theory is different. And it's good to be involved in both. And this informs my research and also my practice. And so that's part of me. And I've worked in the industry before, and I've been in different universities also in different parts of the world. So I have a kind of international background behind me. And I've been also involved and in the kind of network in Europe in relation to the integral model and movement. And so but also critically doing research on this, in terms of further developing it. And that's, in short, my background. Yeah.
Awesome.
And I'm interested in also, applications like yours. You are really trying to build bridges between the integral and the practice in the business world. So I'm really also open for learning from you here, and looking forward to having a conversation with you about the applications of integral leadership and agile here together with you. Yeah.
I'm fairly sure we'll all have war stories to exchange of trying to bring this beautiful thing to the real world and the issues we have sometimes. But for now, it would be nice to hear. I mean, obviously, you have a lot of experience with integral and leadership, and I would assume, as the dean of a faculty in organizational studies, you've probably come across Agile at some stage. What have you seen of Agile? What do you know of it? What's your take on it? Is it good? Is it bad? Is it the future? Is it better than integral? Should it be combined? Go ahead.
Well, it's part of an unfolding, field. I think I see Agile as being partly practiced at our university because our other vice president is actually informed by Agile and used also to bring this in before he left and established their own company. So our university has been inspired by trying to make the employees working on solutions. I think that's one of the core ideas which is really working somehow, because it's more than empowerment. It's allowing to develop methodological skills to solve problems on their own. And I think this is related to also the participatory approach which we try to develop. So it's trying to overcome this top-down and also not just bottom-up, but thinking in lateral terms of, like our students in peers learning best, also employees working together and co-creating, and also leaders as facilitators and coaches helping to make these processes possible. That's what I've experienced in terms of elements of Agile being practiced at our university and also at other places to which I am in contact too. And the integral plays an important orientational role and also kind of big picture dimension, which is relevant to deal with complexities. And I think this is partly what I see as a value here, to provide possibilities to approach issues, problems differently. That's my reading. But I also saw and read about the problems of certain forms of accelerations and speeding up. And I understand the need for quick provision of quality and services and software, in your case also, but I also see the need sometimes for slowing down, for being responsive and not just being quick. And so I have some questions about, these kind of claims and realities, and also need perhaps for further developing it.
It would make sense to give you a background on how we came to this point.
Yes.
So over the course of the years, working at different organizations, I noticed that there were specific things that were being left out. There were elements of agility that were working very well, but there were other elements of it that either weren't being addressed at all. And in order to cover those gaps, not using integral consciously, I found different ways. I kind of created my own little tricks and tips and hacks to create the result that I knew was possible to be created, but that Agile didn't completely address. And over the years, I met other coaches who had similar levels of success.
Yeah.
And being in this industry, you'll see there's lots of different practitioners who are very focused on the process or the framework or getting things right, and they lose sight of why are we doing this at all, right? The intention is to create a better result, to make people's lives better, et cetera, et cetera. And so there was a small minority of other coaches that intrinsically understood this, and they also came up with these little hacks, tips, and tricks, and it was interesting how similar our approaches were to creating these things. So I had the idea of well, what if we had a conversation about integral theory, and could the overt use of integral theory create something that we could codify, and that we could take these things that we've developed independently and turn them into a tool set that not only we could use internally, but we could bring to the rest of the world and help other coaches who are like-minded, help empower them with something that's been thought through and that could help them get to that next stage in their own career and their own journeys.
So it's about repurposing and the meaning dimension. Why is this kind of activities relevant and important and valuable? And success is extendedly interpreted. And so the integral helps to provide something more than just the conventional traditional forms of being effective and efficient and successful. I understand that. So it's this kind of extension and more comprehensive consideration of purpose and meaning and transformation in an extended sense. Is that right? So that's the aspiration, and you found then ways to bring that into the business world and also being compatible and trying to offer a different kind of service than conventional coaches and consultancies, right?
Right. And the most important thing to all of us was that this is something simple and it's something accessible. So one of the things that we talk about often in Agile is everybody overcomplicating everything and trying to create some new way of approach or some new element that's going to differentiate them, and to overcomplicate something to the extent that they have created a niche for themselves. But what that ends up doing is you've got all of these specialists running around doing, really specializing in part of the solution, and therefore not actually achieving results because they're not looking at everything systemically.
Yes. They're kind of, they want this distinction, but this is losing sense of the whole. They're not holonic. They're just focusing on some particular parts for a distinction strategy, but lose, the link to the big picture and to the integral dimensions. That's a classical problem, also being investigated in research. Yes, so reductionistic approaches which losing sight to the overall perspective, and integral allows us to continue always referring back to the overall perspective and even beyond the the cooperation. That's also important as an extension, right? Okay, I understand that. That's where you come from and what you develop. Yeah.
So, sorry to interrupt. I'm personally, maybe selfishly, really interested in how you handle leadership, because I think as much as us folks at organizations are trying to coach those people within those organizations about the system and about looking at things holonically, I think people get it, but I oftentimes find that where I get stopped is with leadership and convincing leadership that there is a return on their investment when they buy into that, when they stop seeing themselves as the end all be all and they start seeing themselves as part of the whole. And I'm very curious in your position of working with leaders and in your experience with leadership, how do you get to their level to help them understand that they're not the final say of everything and that they have to be a team player?
Well, in my own leadership practice, it's different because we are a kind of charity organization. So, and we are having different kind of employees probably compared to the standard organizations, even standard universities. So I cannot really compare, but I've read about other studies and I know about, other organizations and their problems in terms of leadership. And so the challenge is that conventional leaders don't realize the role and quality and value of Integral often, and they don't want to give up power. That's one of the tricky issues. You have to decentralize power, and a lot of conventionally also trained and educated leaders are not ready for that. This kind of decentralizing and also flat hierarchies or overcoming conventional positional power is a main challenge. And probably we need a new generations of people for that in a way. That's perhaps we cannot wait for that. That's another problem. Yeah, it's a classical problem because of bad education and certain kind of conventional power games which are going on. And so these are some explanations why this is happening. And one way to change it is to select employees and managers differently and to educate them differently in universities, but also in further education in companies. That's one way, so not only training, but also really trying to develop, other practices where they can experiment with other forms. And then also, using sociocracy or holocracy elements. So practicing elements of a new way of relating to other human beings, and that's one way to get more to that, which is a long way to go. And I really have highest appreciation and respect for your work. They are being patiently doing and trying to subversively bring the Integral into the practice world. I can imagine how challenging it might be just to get into companies. And but I think the consciousness for Integral approaches will also grow because, if you don't do that, you are perhaps losing competitive advantages. And so this might be also in terms of business logic, you can sell this as also having certain success in the conventional world by offering these, other approaches.
In line with this, Wendelin. So I remember once we had a conversation where you mentioned Agile is in a way proto-integral, right? In that we keep seeing the new emergence of new forms of leadership and new forms of organization that always seem to get a little bit more integral the further we get along. Obviously, Agile is more integral than waterfall, right? And maybe the thing that comes after Agile, if something comes afterwards, would be a step closer. Yeah. It is that kind of how you view the world of work and organizations and leadership, in that it will, obviously it's a slow process, but it will eventually go more and more integral until we reach something that is maybe just called integral management instead of Agile, or integral organizations or something like this. Maybe it doesn't even have a name at that stage. Yeah. But is Agile just a step towards that in your book?
At least it's an important medium for whatever will come after. I'm not as optimistic that there's a kind of natural progress, because there might be also crises, and we see the constraints of crises also, in terms of further Integral and investment into Integral. But I think Agile is an important medium, which, you try to bring this subversively in somehow or kind of indirectly, and it plays an important role. And it's contributing probably, but it's one way among others. There are other forms which also promotes the Integral in other ways, and I know about other approaches which also do their part. So I think Agile is one element and one medium. It's a medium for bringing this up, and there's a learning process, and I think you're learning, but also your customers will learn, and also perhaps science and academia and research can learn from what you're doing. And so this is a reflection also, about what is going on. But I'm not as optimistic as I used to be, that because I was convinced that the Integral, because it makes so much sense, right? And so plausible and so convincing in a way. And to be holonic and to be Integral makes so much sense, and it's so valuable and meaningful. But to convince other people that for the same is not the same as you realizing it. So I don't think that it's necessarily or deterministically will unfold automatically in this direction. We don't know. Crises are very ambivalent, and the constraints which we are experiencing it can have all kinds of effects, not only in favor of more integral. So I'm more cautious.
Well, that's our objective, so we try to keep things as concrete as we possibly can. And, so Agile is at its core an empirical, scientifically derived methodology. So we hope to bring these ideas to the world, and we hope, to your point, that there's a self-evident aspect of it, that like, not only is this a better way to do things, but it measurably creates a better result faster for the client. And that's the hope.
And that's why the right side, the two right quadrants, are so decisive, because there's this objectivizing measurement part. And that's probably the reason why you call it product. I was slightly irritated by your presentation of the integral model, which documents your kind of processing, but calling it product or artifact, in these two different figures, is, of course, because you want to show there's evidence, measurement,
Right.
But I think it's very important to mention also performance there. I can only encourage you, and as far as I know, in my attempts to convey these ideas and to convince practitioners, there need to be these KPIs mentioned and performances. But of course, this is kind of old time thinking, anachronistic somehow. But it seems that some people don't accept something if there is not a measurable effect on performance. So I was surprised that you didn't mention performance explicitly, and having product and artifacts there as a naming title for the upper right quadrant.
Yeah, I mean, performance is in there. If you look at, so this is the point that you were talking about, where we're kind of trying to slide it in. So we do have a 4-quadrant assessment of every role and every ceremony, and performance is in there. And on top of that, we're very clear that the way to achieve those performance-based results is by focusing more on the left side, which is what Agile does not do, but it's not necessarily what our clients want to buy. So if we're deploying if the business world is primarily orange from a spiral dynamics perspective, then we need to strongly speak in an orange language, even though when we're on site with the client, we're more integral. We're bringing in, the green left side cultural elements. And we do that without explicitly saying that we're doing that, so that we don't turn off our clients.
Yeah. I understand that. That's, you're selling it. You need to sell it, and that's what they also, the logics are like that, what they look for. And so to bring in the left side, you need to make this right side strong. But I met practitioners, who won't accept anything integral without KPIs, and this measurement tool. And I'm very critical about that, of course, because it's not really measuring performance. Performance is not only what you measure in, it's a complex process, and this measurement is only kind of covering parts of what is happening actually. And yes, but it's also the interplay between the quadrants which is ultimately decisive. And so because I'm always using double arrows between the quadrants to show the interrelationship, but also the conflicts and incompatibilities to work on, because the relationship between the quadrants is decisive and vital. And I'm always using, as Edward knows, this kind of interrelatedness also as the in-between. So my question to you would be, how agile are you in moving between the quadrants and processing that in your work?
The way we approach that is by looking at the 4 quadrants at the same time and not focusing only on one quadrant. So we try to see, let's look at this. Like doing like this, the 4 quadrants, understand each of them, and then let's focus on one, action item or one thing per quadrant, so that the person or the organization or the team can practice in each of the 4 quadrants simultaneously or at the same time, maybe not in space and time, but having in mind that if you only work on only one quadrant, then the other 3 quadrants are going to go down. And we believe that it is important to look at this in a comprehensive way, and that each quadrant relates to each other and impacts on the other. So that's how we try to approach, by looking at the 4 quadrants at the same time.
Terra evolving,
Yes.
That's the idea. That's but also how they speak to each other, and sometimes there might be also tensions, conflicts, incompatibilities between them, and that's another perhaps challenge. To use also the integral map, because it's just a construct as a map, can help to diagnose issues in the organization where these are not evolving together and where they are, fighting with each other. Individual concerns and technology concerns and system concerns are perhaps also in clash. Yeah, and so that's perhaps I found this amazing because I'm also doing conflict management. I'm just tomorrow I have a teaching on conflict management, and so I'm using this also as a kind of indicator of where are things not being harmoniously involving. That's the ideal case where everything is working together, but I think it's not the case very often. And it might be interesting as an indicator of that. That's just another possibility and reading of that, but also showing the relationship between the quadrants. I think it's also perhaps educationally quite important, and because it's not thinking in silos anymore. It's also dynamic, and it's perhaps interesting to consider elements of showing that also in graphs and on web pages. I don't know. That's up to you, but I just try to sensitize you for the more dynamic processual approach, which also is a further development also, as far as I know, to go away from these separate quadrants. I'm kind of post-Wilberian. We have been in contact with Ken Wilber, and we have been in exchange, and I'm part of a further development, also independent from Ken Wilber, and trying to advance this model also. And so I'm just also bringing this up as a kind of post-Wilberian approach in a way, just because the research is also looking at this and the limitations of this quadrant model and trying to further developing it. And it's just responding to what I saw there compared to where I do my research. That's just a kind of feedback.
I was going to take the conversation in a slightly different direction, Professor. I know you obviously look at theory, but you also look at practical application. And you said you've done some studies at the practical application of this integral in leadership. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about where some of the more advanced companies that you've seen applying integral to leadership in the commercial setting, and particularly if you've got any, a lot of us work in financial institutions, so if you've got any examples of that, I'd be very interested to hear.
Well, I know someone who is doing research on integral finance in Munich. I can give you the contact details if you want to have someone who is working on that.
Yeah.
And then social banks also try to experiment with that. Edward, I can give you the contacts later, perhaps. GLS Bank and the social banks in Germany, they try to experiment with that. And there's someone I know in Munich, and also not only integral finance management, but also integral investment and integral forms of using capital streams in different ways. So I can provide you with these contacts, which might be helpful for you, or interesting, or no. But in terms of applications, the most interesting companies are often not for profit, and most of the companies Lalou, for example, use. Lalou are not in it's NGOs or clinics or other kind of organizations, and it's quite telling. And so I've done a study with a hospital, for example, also, and trying to understand vulnerability of the caretakers differently. So who's taking care of the caretaker? In Europe, there's quite a problem with this health system, the health industry, and one blind spot was the caretakers or the nurses and and so I've worked empirically and I'm also in France with a hospital, and also in contact with a colleague of mine in Switzerland on hospitals. That's one area which I found interesting because I'm interested in integral care and vulnerability, and how can it be, how can it be an ability, and not just negatively seen. And so these are more applications in the area of health and care, and so that's more my application.
If we move back to corporate, have you seen Integral tried in a corporate? Have you ever worked in a real corporate organization and tried to push for Integral? Or if we can't find instances of companies in the corporate world that have really succeeded trying to apply Integral, why does it fail? Why, if it's so great, then why is there no shining
Well,
example?
is it failing, or is it not understood? Is it not realized? Are the people in power not open enough? And there are many reasons which might explain that, why the for-profit business is or has experimented with it and then not continued. McKinsey has used it, but then didn't somehow not continued. So it perhaps there are the short-term benefits were not sufficient. That could be one explanation. I can imagine, it's the fashion and fade syndrome. Something becomes hype, and then to experiment with it, and if it's not directly benefiting and generating advantages, it's been, or again been, not continued. That might be one explanation. So getting short-term advantages seems to be a must in the for-profit world, and if you don't have that, it's challenging. So that's one explanation I can think of. And of course, it's you need coalition partners in a way, and if you have some at least integrally informed people on the board or in leadership positions, then it's easier. And so if you don't have that, so I think it's not just that you just get into a company and then make it integral. You need a preparational work, and you need contacts of people, and perhaps some kind of integrally informing people. That's similar like the mindfulness people. Mindfulness is big business nowadays. And how did they get into companies? Well, perhaps, for example, offering a course for free that people experienced it somehow, or providing some kind of little trials. And this was then convincing, and for others to have, I'm in contact with some people who are doing mindfulness training, and sometimes there is this kind of this effect in where people have experienced it and tell their boss about it, or the boss has experienced it him or herself, and then they want more of it. Because without experience, without being informed, without relating, it's foreign. And so the challenge will be how to bring it in, right? How to make it appealing and fascinating, and that's part of perhaps of your marketing work also. I don't know how you get into your deals, but it seems to be that's the way in. Oh, what is your experience?
It's funny you should say that, because from our perspective, Agile isn't working, and people are still buying it because they think it's the thing they're supposed to buy. So we're using Integral to actually make Agile work. So it's funny that you say, well, maybe there's a failure to go all the way with Integral because they're not seeing the result. They're not seeing the result that they're being sold from the Agile transformations that they're getting. So we're using Integral to create those results. And to your point, it's well, how do we get that message out there to say, well, this will actually give you, if you use Integral and Agile, then it will actually give you the transformative effects that Agile promises, but is not today delivering upon.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. Okay. But even buying into the Integral is challenging for most people, but you need to show that tools work somehow. That's what you do, trying to compensate the deficits of Agile with some Integral tricks, or tricks of the Integral, and not only tricks, but means and measures to make it work and experiential, where people see the difference, experience the difference. That's key. Yeah. And
one of the big things is that I think when people misunderstand Agile while doing an Agile transformation, which is unfortunately a fairly regular thing, they don't know what they're really wanting. And we can use Agile frameworks and kind of right-side Agile stuff to give them what they think they want, right? Which is the boards and the scrum and the rituals and the artifacts and all this, right? So we can use Agile for the kind of face value, but then, what they want is split into two things. They want to see the Agile side, and they want to have the long-term effect of productivity. So like, in my opinion, we can almost use Agile as like a mask, in that we come in, set up the backlog, we set up the board, we've got these buzzwords that they like. They see the Agile structures, and then we realize to get the positive effect that you need the holistic kind of approach. And we can use Integral to start driving for the results that they want while holding up the, you know, the Agile show. I'd like to hear Alana or Ben respond on that one, because I've gone off on a little bit of my own idea here. You guys are much more experienced in the Agile world and what Agile Transformation wants to see.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fundamentally the same, the problem, right? How do you get Integral in to a commercial setting? The answer is we don't. We get Agile in and we supplement Agile with Integral perspectives to help us to get more successful. Will we get there in the future? I would love us to be able to kind of do something successfully for a year or two and then pull back the curtain and say, ta-da, actually, you're using Integral leadership. And then that's our in. I'm not sure how close we are to doing that. But yeah, we certainly don't go in with the headline saying Integral leadership. We go in with the headline saying Agile, and then we might make reference to some Integral material or concepts.
And we've talked a lot, especially you have also, about kind of trust and buy-in. If people don't see the value in something, that you have to just kind of say, trust me, this works, like, join me on this, I'll get you the results you need, you know? So it's also like, even if we were to go in and say, this is Integral or something, they go, I don't understand it. And we would go, instead of, let me try and explain it to you right now, because you know as well as I do, as well as Lucci knows, that going into someone blind and trying to explain Integral and an Integral approach isn't going to work very well. So we kind of have to say, you're not going to understand this, but we're going to do it and you'll see the results, and trust me, right? And then we have our track record of being successful where we go before. And we have the, you know, the put up of, you try with one person and you buy a second and you buy a third, because every time we show up, you know,
the recommendation, you know, and also you have case studies. I saw you have this in this journal page where you can look on a newsletter or a journal where you provide material on what has worked in the past, and so people might then trust you and follow and allow you to also work with them. And
I was gonna, oh, sorry, Professor. I was just gonna build on what Ben and Eddie just said. I've done it in the opposite way, where I worked with a team for a year, very much in an Integral fashion, but under this guise of Agile.
Yeah.
And after a year of working with them, they trusted me. So I got to this point of pulling back the curtain, so to speak, and explaining in a bit of detail about holons and quadrants and about the ways that I've used it. And it clicked with them because I'd been with them for a year. They were able to see the examples that I gave because they lived through it with me. And after I explained it, they were like, this is great. How do we get everyone else at the company to do it? And it's just not that simple. I mean, they could see it, but then selling it to, say, leadership to do this is, Agile is so known as this transformation, this like people buy Agile, but to then buy Integral is a different, you need the trust there, I think, right now, at least. And I think the only reason why I got there with the group that I worked with was because that trust was already there, but you don't start from that place with your clients most times. So I think that's a huge hurdle, is getting people to just say, just trust us, which, I mean, what company doesn't say that, who wants to get clients, right? So I think that's a tricky part.
Yeah, trust is of course foundational, and having a long-term relationship, building up trust, you know, is a way in. And the challenge will be also that, you know, they're calculating, and they, you know, and more there will be this checking: is it worthwhile to invest into, you know, you as a company? And so probably you need to also, you know, generate effects, but it has effects if you work with people. You know, that's the advantage, and then you are recommended, and it's reinforcing, getting into a reinforcing cycle, you know, this leads to that, and then people buy into it and get into it and trust that they're also, what will follow will also be beneficial. You know, that's probably the way. Having a good story and a trustful process which is reinforcing itself is probably the key in. And working 1 year with a company is of course a very special possibility for building up this. Yeah.
One thing I also want to mention that we haven't touched on is that, like, a big part of us is our like fantastic network of people. And what I have noticed, and what makes me a little bit more hopeful that Integral will eventually win out, is that the people who we work with, who are on board with these ideas and have this Integral view, whether it's conscious or subconscious, have a tendency to do better long term. They're the people who do successful agile transformations. They might be subversive, like subconsciously doing it in an integral way, right? And then they'll be more susceptible to the ideas and stuff. But what we notice is these people rising to the top. And then all of a sudden, you know, the amount of leads of agile transformation or, you know, CEOs or whatever, the amount of those who are integral is only going to increase over time. Or the people who are more like accepting of the idea or thinking that certain way is only going to increase over time because, you know, almost a survival of the fittest. Like you said, it's the best way to do things. So we found a lot of like, when we've made connections with people who have taken on our approach, they've been the people who've continued to rise, so to say. So our client base, in a sense, it kind of self-evolves, right?
Yeah.
I don't know, Ben, a lot
of those who are proved to be better and then climb up the career ladder. That's one way where, you know, more people in powerful positions being integrally informed, at least, you know, open up more doors. But there will be also people successful who are not integral, unethical, tactical, you know, and using means which are the opposite of the integral and its claims. You know, unfortunately, studies also show that you have short-term advantages of being in the black triad, you know, the black triad, you know, of people who are all the opposite of integral and Machiavellian, you know, kind of people who are using unethical means for being successful, at least in short term. And these people also still get into positions. That's also there. And so that's another reality, which is also powerful. And they won't be open up for processes of decentering power, which is also going with the integral. And so sorry for sobering, you know, your optimism a bit, but that's another reality as far as I know from studies. And
no, of course, it's never going to be 100%. One fails, one succeeds. Ben, you've been around, I'd say, like the corporate world and the world of Agile for the longest out of all of us, I guess. What have you seen in terms of what I was my hopeful fantasy?
I think it's very. I think the positive side, or the way that where you're most likely to be correct, I think, is with the younger companies. So there is a distinct difference between younger companies and older companies, and I've worked a lot with both. Older companies tend to be very stuck in their ways, and even when they're challenged to be not stuck in their ways, so there's a dramatic event, sink or swim kind of thing, they're constrained in the bounds of what they think is possible so tightly that even a small step seems like a giant step for them. So I think those companies, to imagine that those companies will be applying integral leadership or integral perspectives and lenses to improve their businesses, I think is probably a stretch too far in my lifetime, at least. Where I do think you might be more successful is in newer companies starting up with no established kind of track record. I think a lot of companies get into this situation where they believe that what got them to this point is what's going to move them on again. So I was successful going from 0 to 5, therefore I'm going to apply the same tactics and structure and thoughts and behaviors going from, and that'll take me from 5 to 10, and clearly that doesn't work. So if we can find companies that are going from 0 to 1 and we can influence them and say, you know, go about this way of working, I think that's the way that we will get more headline adoption of kind of integral theory.
I have an opinion just based on, because my previous client was a quite large company, and I think instead of trying to change the company as a whole and trying to make the company integral, what I think I was able to do with this one team that I gained their trust was that one team then became integral. And then now after leaving, I'm hearing that they're infecting, so to speak, other teams or other areas of the company with what they've learned. And while the whole company probably won't ever be integral, I mean, if we're being realistic, but maybe there will be these small pockets of integral thinking groups, which is better than nothing, I guess, you know. And I think those smaller teams or places in a company, I guess you could see as smaller companies, just to Ben's point. I mean, if you could have that on a smaller scale, I think it's just harder to scale up at some point.
Seeds of the integral, you know, in younger organizations, but also younger generations. and in teams which are finding each other together and bringing it into bigger companies also. That's, I think, two ways to go. And I agree, that's probably possible. And particularly also startups and enterprising companies of new generations of new people. Also some graduates of our university have started their own businesses, and these are organizing themselves differently because they have different value orientation, different expectations, and a new generation is coming, and this might be really not only more open but also experimenting and also practicing it and doing it, and actually some graduates from CARDS are at SAP in Germany, and they also set up a mindfulness group there. They were one of these teams you mentioned, kind of sub-teams which a contagious effect on other teams. Oh, look at them, they're organizing, doing something differently, and it's that's also the way, when you can really implant some seeds which then grow, but you need to cultivate them. And also studies about mindfulness show if you don't have resources, if you don't have a room where you can do your mindfulness, or if you don't find like-minded people, it will die and dry out. So there needs to be the question of how to cultivate. Also, perhaps for you, how can your clients you have dealt with continuously being kind of supported somehow? That's, I think, the long-term cultivation and cherishing is also important.
Okay, I want to ask us one more short question, and then I think it's time for us to wrap because we don't have too much time left. A very, very quick question on a specific topic I wanted to hit on was, so myself, Alana, and Ben, and Lucci and Lior, we all often have to try and move reluctant leaders to think a little bit more integral, right? We try our best to coach them. For us, it's more of a shooting up or like punching up kind of situation. I don't want to describe your relationship with you and your students as punching down, but you've also probably had future leaders who you are teaching and you're educating, and you're trying to coach them into understanding integral thinking and approaching things more integrally. We often receive pushback. I assume that leadership is much more resilient to ideas like this than your students are to your ideas. At least I hope so. But have you had a student who's been very, someone who wants to go into management, who's been very resilient to integral thinking and said, this is all a little bit silly and I don't really understand this, I don't really like this, or it just didn't click for them, this is too complex, I don't get it? How have you dealt with students in the past who have really had like barriers towards, because it can't always be I teach them integral and then they get it and they're great and they're like, I'm going to go become an integral leader. You must have had some kind of pushback similar to the ones we get.
Well, at our university, we select our students, so that's perhaps not representative for other universities, and so the amount of students who are open, at least for these ideas, is quite is there. But there are people who don't. It's not just a question of liking or disliking. It's about also it's too complex, too many. Particularly if you extend it to the development lines and the stages and the types and so on. If it gets into the more advanced forms and dimensions, for some it's too much, and also were some people reluctant in terms of too much inner sides, interior dimensions. If you address the upper left part, there's a certain reluctance of opening up for telling about feelings and inner dimensions.
So what do you do? That's the real question is, sorry to cut you off, but we don't have too much time. What do you do? Do you kind of let them go and say, if they're not going to get it, they're not going to get it? Or do you have some kind of tips and tricks of like, oh, usually I tell them to meditate by a waterfall and then it clicks or something like this?
And being inviting and using the peer effect that other students who get it, inform them. So creating exercises, possibilities, so that not me as lecturer, or professor of supposed authority is telling, and by the way, not telling, but in the sense of selling, but showing and enabling experiences and peer effects, so that it's not just me imposing or conveying something or lecturing. I don't like to lecture, because these people don't need to be lectured, but creating conditions for experiencing it. That's the way. And peer effects where other people tell them and where also informally things happen. So creating little environments and experiments and exercises where people can discover and to dare to do it because others also encourage them to do it, not me. That's one way. And this is because there's also resistance against authority. There's a kind of, if someone like in a position of power say something, it's different than a colleague. So this might be interesting also in terms of team development, to create conditions where teams are, encouraging, some team members encourage others also to try out things.
Good. And I think it's very interesting to hear that you have to create kind of almost experiments or set up situations where they can experience it instead of teaching it. I can imagine that all of us have tried to create kind of, hey, look at this is where integral works, or paint a picture in creating some kind of sculpted situation to show value to leaders in the workspace. I think that's it for us now. Wendelin, thank you so much for coming by. It's been a really great talk. I think there's a lot of value for any listener who's stuck around this long. Thanks, Alana. Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Luci. Thanks, Lior. And with that, I think we're good to close.
I think we're done. And if there are any other resources, links for anything that the professor has that we can share, we'll put that in the description below for the video. Thank you.